Hello. This film is part of a series of conversations I'm having with academics from Lancaster University's Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion. This department has a rich and celebrated history and study of religion, and these conversations are intended to showcase some of the research and expertise found there. You can find more details about the department and the courses they offer via the link below. My name is Benjamin Wood and I'm the subject leader for Religious Studies at Haslingden High School, a large and proudly comprehensive school in Lancashire, where I've been teaching GCSE and A-levels since 2002. Some of these conversations will be linked to the GCSE and A-level courses, while others will focus more broadly on the study of religion and worldviews. The aim is to provide teachers of all key stages with knowledge that isn't just of interest, but can be of use in the classroom, perhaps by presenting new and contemporary thinkers, or providing new examples and data that can contribute to rich learning in our classrooms. I hope you find that this conversation is both useful and enjoyable.
Hello. In this conversation, I'm going to be talking with Professor Chakraverthi Ram Prasad. He is a distinguished professor of comparative religion and philosophy at Lancaster University, and he's a fellow of the British Academy. His areas of expertise include Hindu, Buddhist and Jain religion, comparative phenomenology, epistemology, metaphysics, theology and the philosophy of religion, as well as religion, politics and conflict, South Asian religious identities in contemporary Britain, and the conceptual sources of modern Hindu life and beliefs. Thank you, Professor, for making time this afternoon. I'm looking forward to talking to you. We're going to focus our discussion really on some of the bigger questions that face the study of what we might call religion. That's a contested term, as we will no doubt get to. But let's start there. What problems, particularly based on with your expertise with Indian religion, if we're going to use that word, what problems are there with concepts such as religion and non-religion?
Well, actually, I think there are probably already two questions there. The problems with the concept of religion are, I think, rather well established and widely discussed. And I'll turn to that in a moment. The concept of non-religion is very much premised on a particular reading of the concept of religion, and not in all contexts and cases, seldom discussed, for example, in North America. And it raises interesting questions about contemporary sociology of religion. And I think that's a somewhat different question, and particularly a question that we face in Britain today. So let me go back to the question of what problems religion faces. Conceptually, I think the main argument that has been made is that the concept of religion arises from a very particular trajectory in Western thinking about a cluster of phenomena, that if you go back to the European medieval period, you will not find religion being used in at all in that way. You would have a reference, say, to Christianity as the faith, and you might have an idea of either people who are without faith or people who have erroneous faiths, such as the Jews and the Muslims. And other religious traditions, of course, would not be within the ken of medieval Europe. So religion, as a study of the thing, the rel in Latin, really comes out of an effort to respond to early modern critiques of the concept of faith, of commitment to the Christian doctrines, but essentially to a God who then, on further investigation, turns out necessarily to be a Christian God. As the battle then starts raging in Europe from the 17th century onwards over what it is to be committed to a God, what kind of a God is that, whether such proofs are necessary or possible, you have slowly the growth of a view that says, well, there is a particular kind of debate that is about one's commitment to that tradition and the doctrines of Christianity and the critique or attacks on it. But regardless of the technical debates that are waging right through the 19th and 20th centuries, there is a different question, a question that has to do with the features that nevertheless continue to persist in societies, the feature which at minimum is some kind of an investment in what is beyond the daily commitments, the daily concerns of human beings. And this is the time when Europeans are also coming to understand the staggering diversity of what people are committed to around the world. It's a time of exploration, it's a time of slavery, of colonialism, and mostly hostile, but sometimes interested and even sympathetic engagement with people around the world. So religion then emerges as the category to be studied to some extent, at least theoretically, independent of one's own commitments to doctrines and practices. Now, obviously, what happens is in constructing what religion means, the features of Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity as it is found in Northern and Northwestern Europe, becomes the undergirding of this theoretical construction of the concept of religion. And right from the get-go, then, it is trying to figure out how that category can be applied, not just when we move to other streams of Christianity, but then what happens with Islam, the different streams, and then you get to traditions like the Hindu traditions. So, and then we get even further on, and then we start having non-textual, largely oral traditions or oral textuality, and very different kinds of organization and hierarchies, for example, in traditional African religions. So as we start seeing this, more and more effort then starts going into trying to fit all these different phenomena into parameters that arose from a restricted cultural and geographic region. That still continues to be the case, but there are one or two attempts to counter it. One attempt is to say, well, instead of constantly critiquing the very possibility of the concept of religion, how about if we start looking at other traditions and how they have comparable concepts? But then it's not always obvious when you translate that that concept is exactly the same. And unsurprisingly, it will not be the same based on, in terms of mirroring what might have been discussed in 18th century England or 19th century Sweden. So that remains to this day. Now, when you get to university, we normally try, most institutions would try to get students to think critically about how they use the word religion. In particular, to not think there are essences to even a religion like Christianity or Islam, and bring out the diversity and internal challenges and disputes, as well as really putting pressure on the very concept of religion as a united or unifying idea when it is applied to, say, the Hindu traditions. This is complicated by two things. One complication is that then it becomes very difficult to think of how to call the discipline. In America, they don't call it religious studies, they call it the study of religion, for example. But we need to be telling students, or even each other, what it is we are talking about. So we need to have at least a provisional commitment to the concept of religious traditions. The second thing is, as globalization and in modernity happens, whether it's the Japanese or the Chinese or the Indians or the Nigerians or the Amazonians, people start saying, well, it's not as if we cannot engage with those terms. It's not like we are lesser. It's not like we are lacking in religion, which is sometimes seen as the point and purport of Western critiques of the concept of religion. A lot of people would say, certainly in India they would do, for example, that the West constructs us and deconstructs us, and we have no word here. So there's no point in telling us, oh, Hinduism is not a religion, any more than it is for you to have decided we were a religion. What it is to call Hinduism is something that Hindus of different sorts might bring to the table as their sense of self. So for these two reasons, an academic and a kind of social one, we can't easily write away the concept of religion. The difficulty comes not so much in universities, which at least take as part of their approach, their pedagogical approach, to make students sensitive to the concept of religion. A lot of school teachers would love to do that. They were students themselves of these traditions. They are looking around and they see how these tides of for and against religion, how people represent themselves and others, constantly flows through society. But what do we do when we have an apparently simplified and essentialized curriculum? How do you simultaneously introduce students to school pupils, to the variety of issues that constitute the background for what they are studying, while also telling them what they are studying is itself part of the critical scrutiny in a way in which perhaps physics and chemistry are not. So that's the context in which we find ourselves.
Yeah. So perhaps I could ask you maybe for some examples. So if we take somebody from the Hindu tradition, what might they object to in the sense of that idea of being termed a religion, knowing that particular concept has a history associated with the West? So are there practical things that they might say, well, hang on a minute,
well, there are lots of different things going on. We've always got to be careful about the context in which these questions arise. People who might feel comfortable in how Hinduism is construed, for example, in writing up the religious studies syllabus on Hinduism in Britain, for example, particular communities might have been consulted, might have given their own views. They might say, we do accept the concept of religion because we don't want to be seen as without religion, because we have, the cultural memory of 100, 200 years ago when we were thought of as irreligious because not Christian. But we should be careful that the model of religion doesn't go through the same kind of expectations. The idea of, for example, one God. The belief in monotheism, the belief in one central text or a founding figure. Now, if you think of the one God, Hindus would say, well, yes and no. A lot of people would say, looked at one way, there is the notion of a single God. Looked at another way, that's completely untrue to the lives of Hindus. So, yes, we want you to have the notion of Hinduism, the idea of Hinduism as a religion, but look at the details of our beliefs and don't start with the assumption that there is a particular type of speaking about religion. Now, this is a very difficult matter, because if you then simply turn around and say, oh, Hindus don't believe in one God, they don't have a single founder, then what you're doing is you're implicitly still sticking to the paradigm of what a religion is and simply defining Hinduism as a religion other than the implied model of Christianity or indeed the Abrahamic traditions. So that's one way of in which certain kinds of Hindus, relatively confident about their situation within their traditions, might say. But there are more far-reaching critiques of Hinduism which seldom make it into these kinds of debates, which is people who might live particular social lives which are Hindu. They in the normal historical definition of the range of phenomena which comes within that definition, but who have been marginalized, who have been precisely denied access to, say, the Vedas, say, entry into particular temples, to the rites and rituals that only some sections of Hindus have always been permitted. They want to say, Well, either we want to walk away from Hinduism, if what you mean by Hinduism is what these people have defined, in which we have historically been excluded, or you will have to really get into the messy business of pulling apart assumptions of any religion, and you'll start finding these variations. Now, this could happen with Christianity. If you go to Brazil and you have Brazilian religious traditions which coexist with Christianity. Even yesterday, I was seeing a travel documentary, in which the person reacts to the presence of these practices by saying it's a curious combination of religion and superstition, and we know which is which, don't we? So now think of the Hindu traditions as constantly evolving in exactly the same way. People go to a huge range of different places of worship, and yet a huge number of people have also been forbidden entry until under the pressure of modern Indian law to even get to these places. So there are a lot of people who would say whether we are Hindu or not will depend on what that definition is. And we have to reserve the right of either walking away from being called Hindus, or to really put pressure on your assumptions. But by the time you do that, you're way past having the 3 pages and 1 hour on Hinduism that a religious studies curriculum might permit in many schools.
Yeah. So a couple of questions there. How important is it to perhaps for us to distinguish in schools, perhaps when we might be talking about the Hindu tradition found in India and the Hindu tradition as found in the UK? Is there a distinction we should be putting a geographical caveat on those? And related to that, has the Hindu community in the UK, how have they, in the context of what is a religion, say, how have they responded to being in the UK? Is there a sense of a pressure to conform with a certain model, do you think?
Well, I think the questions are interrelated. Broadly, there is no reason to think that. There must be a distinction between Hinduism in India and Hinduism in Britain, because the people who are Hindus here mostly come from are of Indian origin. So even if they come from Guyana or Fiji or Uganda, they were 2 or 3 generations away, coming from the places where their ancestors had been for any number of centuries. So sometimes a variation in Hinduism that you find in this country is really tied to where people have come from. And if you look at particular temples in Britain, where the people expressly want to recognize the layering of who goes there and what rituals are followed and what forms are worshipped, really is a kind of a historical anthropology of where people have come from and what kind of tradition, inherited traditions they were in. The problem would come if we stripped that away completely and treated a particular form of worship of people from a particular demographic of Hindus who, by historical accident, dominate the community here. Now, if we treat that as standing in for all Hinduism, then that's a real problem. However, what are we to do about this? Because there's limited room for maneuver logistically. Because schools and boards look to try and integrate some teaching, say, of Hinduism within this preconceived, framework, straitjacket of teaching religion. Then they turn around and say, well, we don't want to just make it up ourselves. We don't want this to be kind of a colonial writing of your experience. Tell us, who do you go to? You scramble around. You say, oh, there is this community that has got its, outward-looking officer. There's a community officer. There is a head of research or teaching, and you go and ask them. Now, not necessary that those people would represent the diversity of the traditions they come from. They will speak wholeheartedly about their tradition, And they don't necessarily want to deny other ways of being Hindu, but that is what they know. And in post-war Britain, the people who know that diversity of traditions tend to be Western academics of Hinduism in universities. So you're caught here. Are you going to go for the authentic, in particular, in terms of what people themselves feel their tradition is? Or are you going to look at people who are going to give you a particular kind of academic view? It's that's the problem. In terms of adapting, well, people have adapted across South Asia for millennia. People have adapted across the world. Diasporas everywhere have got these complex connections. Sometimes they preserve traditions at the time of immigration better than their native villages and towns did. So I don't think that adapting to circumstances of being immigrants in Britain has done a great deal to what people, see themselves as Hindus any more than they would living in Mumbai or Delhi. But who they are, which background they come from, can completely overrepresent their particularity and claim in a way or give the impression that that's what Hinduism is.
I see. Now, the sort of the sheer volume, the sheer range of diversity that you are pointing out here, in some sense, as like say a teacher in a school where I might have a small amount of time to devote to the study, not just of Hinduism, for example, but with the whole subject, there is very little time within schools. So some would argue that what we need to be doing in schools is focus on what might be called an essentialistic curriculum, understanding its limitations and its flaws, but we need to focus on mainstream theological ideas, key concepts within a religion, practices, and so on. What do you say to that argument that we have to do that first in order to help pupils to progress so that they can, in time, come to the kind of understanding you're talking about?
Well, first thing I would say is that I'm not sure an essentialist misrepresentation is the best place to start from. It's simply the case that essentialisms are arbitrary. So you think you're teaching Christianity, probably not anything about the Maronites or the Syrian Christians or even Russian Orthodox, right? At most, Catholic schools might teach, Catholicism, and other schools, not only Church of England schools, but other schools, when they teach Christianity, they are broadly talking about a particular kind of Anglican Christianity. And some of the differences, never mind, say, Brazilian combinations of candomblé and Christianity and so forth, which are also Christianity as far as those practitioners are concerned. So already, even with what we think is straightforward, like Christianity, is taught out of a very narrow base. Now, I can understand the restrictions, of course, of the hours taught, the time that can be given to this, how much children can assimilate. The key will be to teaching non-essentialistically. And the important thing to do in that is to qualify, contextualize, always tell children we're learning one slice, just to say this is where we're coming from. Now, there is a related problem, though, which is the flip side of it, which is it would be perfectly possible when people talk about, Britain, England particularly being a Christian country. What they are, of course, meaning is the tangled historical legacy that arises out of the Church of England. They are not, in fact, talking about Syrian Christians. So we don't, of course, want to swing to the other side and become aggressively insular and saying, we are only going to teach you Christianity, and by Christianity we mean Anglican Christianity, Church of England Christianity, not even Anglican, because there are, as we well know, differences of theological interpretation, for example, in South Africa or in Nigeria or in India, in the Church of South India, which often theologically challenges a great deal of what the Church of England might think of as the conception of the Anglican Communion. So you don't want to swing to that. So what do we do? The best way, I think, would be to say, look, when you're going to be reading these 2, 3, or 4 religious traditions, you're going to be seeing slices of them. So when we are teaching you Christianity, we are just in the context of our schools and the kind of background from which many of you would come, if not you yourselves, your parents, your grandparents' generation, we tended to belong to the Church of England. So we're going to put it in that way. We are not standing in for Christianity. And then Christianity is not standing in for the understanding of other traditions. So if you're going to say, when we're talking about Hinduism, this is really from the background of the majority of Hindu immigrants to this country who are Gujarati Vaishnavas. So here is a slice that you see. So present each of this. It's likely to be that Islam is going to be Sunni Islam, and it's also probably going to have a particular kind of, say, Hanafi or interpretation. So if you're clear, you don't need to tell the kids the exact roots of that specificity, but introduce to them what are seen as slices that are that have some reason for being taught, and which are equally so in the plurality of all world traditions, so that they learn something to say, oh, well, this is the way we from our family might do down the road. That's the way from which, Salim next to me might do it. This is the way in which Aisha might do it. So, okay, so we get some of that. So you do introduce something which is logistically manageable, which can be in textbooks, which have time that you could teach, that children can absorb when they're 12 and 13. But at the same time, you prep them away from essentialism. You prep them away from universalization. And yet you prepare them perhaps even better to face the diversity of the world, whether they do religious studies at university or not. You prep them to see that people are particular in the context in which they come, but most people want to take their particularism to have as much application as possible. That's just a human tendency.
Okay. Now,
actually, I think we might have to go back now to the question of non-religion with which you began, because this is a good point to segue to.
Yes. Yep.
So non-religion clearly arises in exactly the context of, in this context, in post-war, excuse me, English society. Although we might say that you can talk about, to some extent, a particular kind of decline in particular types of church-going belief in other parts of Europe, as well as in, say, Australia or Canada, not in America. What we really talk about here when we're talking about non-religion is what has happened to the Church of England. Even the Church of Scotland, there are, again, slightly tangled and different experiences, I think, and certainly it doesn't apply in Northern Ireland for obvious reasons. And what we mean by this is that, yes, along with the well-worn Western European story of fall in church attendances, fall in the evocation of Christian doctrine as expressions of moral framings or government policies after the war. In England in particular, you have a way of engaging with global flows of new paradigms. Hare Krishna movement in the 60s, for example, or the popularization of yoga and so forth, as well as a deep, a respectful engagement with the pluralization of English society through immigration. So people are watching the shift happening around them even as they, in relation to their parents, are already changing within their own Christian perspective. So you end up having the growth of people who say, when looking for patterns of explanation, when looking for rituals that hold us together, we seek some kind of meaning which is not gobbled up in consumerism and the next material gratification, or an acknowledgement of the pointlessness of life and so forth. We're wanting something which is doing that job. But faced with both our attenuated relationship with the faith of our ancestors, and by our growing knowledge of a complex society with complex ideas available, we move into thinking of ourselves in terms of a contrast to religion, while at the same time preserving some of those purposes. Now, this is a constant pattern in the West. In the 1820s, Auguste Comte was talking about positivism as exactly a kind of a competing secular religion. So I don't think in itself non-religion is some kind of a conceptual breakthrough, but it is an interesting, let alone a universalizing, a globalizing one. But it is a way of articulating the complex way in which a lot of people who 2 generations ago would have thought of themselves as Christian, and meaning by which they meant belonging to the Church of England, are nevertheless looking at framing the search for meaning in a systematic way that does not go back explicitly to particular kinds of sacred roots. So I think it's a good way of looking at it. It is likely that, especially in less diverse, ethnically diverse schools, a lot of children and their parents will probably be in that position. So it's worthwhile as a sociological development to introduce it to them. But it is as much to be qualified, localized, and particularized as all the other things we were talking about in terms of religion before.
So related to that, there is, there's a discussion coming from the Commission on RE in 2018 of the idea of worldviews. And so they put forward a recommendation that the subject sort of needs to evolve, needs to move forward, perhaps to move away. And people are talking about, kind of moving away from the world religions model for many of the problems you've identified, to a worldviews approach. But I guess from what you're saying is the term worldviews is as historically and culturally rooted as religion and non-religion are as terms.
That's right. That's right. Worldviews is, again, a local response to a local problem, right? Which is, well, people are worried about world religions because we have had at least 50, 60 years in which Lancaster has taken a large role. Lancaster University's religious studies has taken a large role in critiquing ways in which religion has been taught, and therefore, what are we going to do? Worldview says everything and nothing. Worldview says nothing because, well, yes, everybody has a worldview, even the most stubbornly materialistic, solipsistic multi-billionaire still has a worldview. So what does a worldview mean? If you're simply then, on the other hand, if you're going to say a worldview is the new way in which we're going to talk about religion, what have you done apart from confusing students and hardworking teachers about what they're talking about? Oh, the worldview of Muslims. I mean, what? So it's of course going to have first. So what kind of traction does it have, except making people feel that they made a gesture towards accepting the plurality of people's ways of looking at the world? Of course, for example, we always have, the secularism, society, secularist society, humanist society talking about, the need to think of secularism in that same way. If you're going to have a thought for the day which is religious, could we have a secular person? And a lot of other people saying, just we don't need a thought for the day, perish the thought. Let's just forget about that 10 minutes where somebody holds forth. Now, is that a worldview? Are you going to get critically deeply enough to say, actually, the status of something like that is itself under question? Unlikely. What the recommendation is really saying is, let's have a sleight of hand by which we kind of tamp down the voices of people, parents getting upset and cross about doctrinal ways of teaching traditions and say, oh, we are included too. What are you going to include? So, and what happens when you look globally? Again, you know, in other parts of the world, but people are going to look and say, they're going to laugh at that. To say, either you lack the strength of your convictions, so we are, you know, Christians or Muslims or Hindus and proud of it, or we're going to say, well, you know, how does this have any explanatory value in distinguishing between traditions or between people who hold commitments and people who don't? There are a myriad of ways. So it might be that there is a need to rethink how we teach traditions, how we bend the definitions, how we blur those boundaries, how you talk within what is now a religious education curriculum about people's commitments that lie beyond what we have thought about as religions. But my view is that if you're going to be pedagogically subtle enough and complex enough that you're qualifying, you're giving kids a sense of specificity, of locality, you're already going to be making them query. At what point is one ceasing to be a Christian? At one point is one ceasing to be a Hindu? Is somebody who's not a practicing Hindu a worldview person in the same way as somebody who's not a Christian anymore or whose parents stopped being observant Jews? So you're preparing them. If it's a methodology for sensitizing children to the blurred nature of people's commitments, it will require more than a term to do that. And if the curriculum itself and the pedagogy that informs it is sensitive enough, I don't think that would be needed either. What we should at all costs try and get out of is thinking that worldview is some kind of a whiz-bang new theoretical terminology that explains human experience in a way nothing has before.
Okay, that's very interesting. I'd like to finish with one slightly more practical question, perhaps. You know, we both teach at different levels, admittedly, but we're both teaching. So before you were talking about, you know, this idea of a slice, you know, you're presenting a slice of the Hindu tradition or Christianity or whatever it is. But then there's sort of the potential of a kind of a paralysis because of the size of the choices available. It's that point, you know, you go into a coffee shop and there's 43 different types of coffee and you don't know how to choose which one you want, and you sort of end up rushing the choice. So in terms of how the decision is made as to which slices, what criteria do you think are important for us to consider in making those decisions?
Well, I mean, I think I touched on it already. Let me bring it out a little bit more, which is that it'll probably vary according to the schools and the demographic of their students. So if you're talking about Christianity and post-Christian views, and you're really talking about what has happened to post-war Church of England, that's the experience that will most speak to kids from that kind of background. So to some extent, there is of course, you don't want to teach those who don't know any other traditions even less, but you might be sensitive to the kind of kids who come and what they're trying to understand. But there is also the larger question of then who's choosing? Is it the exam boards? You know, who sets? Is it the teachers? Is it the school board? So when you say we, I mean, if you're thinking about, you know, where are those decisions made, whoever makes them might have to think a little bit more. But there is no point in trying to pretend that it isn't arbitrary. try as we might, each of us is just going to know more about something than other things. And try as we might know a little bit about some things, but still nothing of everything else. So that's never going to change. So all we could do is to not smuggle in a covert ideology, which centralizes some universal claim. So perhaps if you have a range of 8 or 10 or 12 different options, and then the teachers simply make explicit, and perhaps they go through them over, the exams allow questions to be answered across that range, then teachers might themselves, as I certainly do, get bored after a few years, and they think you're losing the spark on the same thing. You want to try something slightly different. And if a curriculum already has that opportunity for you to move from saying, now, this time I'm going to be talking about, Vaishnava Hinduism, to kind of think about Shaiva Hinduism, South Indian Shaiva Hinduism, something like that. Let us look a little bit more about different slices. So the issue is simply to always be clear that you've had to choose some of these things out of what you know best, out of what you're interested in, what you think will meet the needs of your particular set of students. So those are the only kinds of things. And I think so long as we are therefore open about acknowledging that these surrounding features will make those decisions arbitrary and not try and ascend to some higher order justification, such as Britain is a Christian society kind of thing, I think we are fine. We just have to acknowledge the limits of, this is how human beings work. And I think you don't need anything more than that, provided the curriculum is developed enough to at least offer a larger number of slices than the ones that can ever be taught to one cohort.
I think that's an important point. I think the criteria on which I use, for trying to design where my own expertise lies, and there are many areas it doesn't lie, as you pointed out, for all of us. That's a key one. But actually, maybe if students understand that through necessity, we're only presenting slices. And that understanding, I think, makes them very, very aware then there's a lot more to the cake, as it were, than just the slice I'm giving you. So I think that's a very useful point. Thank you for your time. It was very, very interesting to kind of talk on these broader issues. This is one of the reasons I think it's such a fascinating subject to try and teach in schools, never mind in universities, because we really are grappling with some extraordinarily difficult ideas. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. And I know both, all of us, who teach at different levels, we just want the youngsters who learn with us, from us, to feel that it's still worth learning more about.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, see you then. Bye.
Bye-bye.